I was a 21-year-old male living on the outskirts of the city. I personally enjoyed living in a rural area as I found it more peaceful than living in the city where it was often congested with hordes of pedestrians roaming the streets. The area where I resided was made up of crop fields and farmland, not the commonly seen infrastructure I was used to seeing in the city. It was nothing but just farm animals and broad landscapes glistening within the horizon. I usually was in the city for the latter part of my day as I was a full-time Uber driver that worked close to 12 hours a day. I personally didn't like the job a whole lot, but unfortunately, I didn't have much of a choice as I needed to help my parents pay off their mortgage that was lingering over their shoulders for the last decade or so. I wasn't much of a people person, so I would always drive in silence or casually have the radio playing in the background just to ease the subtle awkwardness of a complete stranger sitting in the passenger seat next to me. I remember on this one particular night, I was heading home from a long shift of driving a bunch of drunk college students around the city considering it was the weekend. The time was around 2 or 3 in the morning when I was driving through the back ends of the countryside as it was usually the quickest route to get home. It was generally recommended not to take this direction during these times as there weren't many street lights around, just tall crop fields and one gloomy road ahead. What the hell was that? I remember getting out of my car and slowly approaching the front bumper just to see what the hell collided with my vehicle. I can recall seeing a deer's body laying lifelessly on the dirt road. It was almost as if the sudden impact from my car had completely obliterated the deer's physical frame into a bloody matter of guts and organs scattered all over the ground. The deer was surprisingly still alive as I could hear it wheezing in agony while its legs began twitching from the initial shock of the collision. I legitimately felt sick to my stomach and immediately went inside my car. I didn't know if calling 911 would be the wisest decision considering I was young and naive. I was honestly convinced that there was a possibility that I could go to jail. That's when I ultimately decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed a pair of latex gloves from the glove compartment of my car, put them on, and held the deer by its legs while manually dragging the dead carcass off to the side of the road. I began hearing police sirens coming from a distance. That's when the paranoia began settling inside my head as I thought someone from afar had called the cops on me. I then went inside my vehicle and began to drive off, not caring if my car had further trampled whatever life was remaining within that deer. It's just a deer. It's just a deer. Don't worry. It's just a deer. It's definitely not a hit and run. I just made an honest mistake. How the hell could it be my fault if there's no goddamn street lights? I eventually made it home and pulled into my driveway as I decided to clean the remaining blood residue lingering on the hood of my car. I didn't want to raise any suspicion from any onlooking neighbors. So, I decided to park my car inside my garage so I could hose my car without the feeling of being watched. After several minutes of intense cleaning, I decided to quietly approach my washroom without waking up my parents. I began to fill my bathtub up with warm water, as the idea of soaking for an hour or two wouldn't hurt my chances of calming my nerves down. The next couple of shifts, I was able to get back on the horse as I conducted business as usual. I honestly swept the entire deer occurrence under the rug, as I needed to get on with my life and not latch on to a simple mistake that inevitably would have happened. I decided to take an entirely alternate route and not the dark back roads when heading home. I couldn't run the risk of hitting another deer, as the guilt from the first deer still tears me to shreds internally. I remember this one night I worked the usual graveyard hours when I picked up this one girl near a busy location in the city. She surprisingly lived in the direction of where I resided, so I figured dropping her off was a bargain one couldn't refuse. As we made our way home, I remember looking at my rearview mirror and seeing a rotting deer's head carcass laying on the back seat of my car. That's when I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and began jetting through the freeway. The Uber customer yelled, "What the hell are you doing, sir? Can you please pull over? I want to get out. Stop the car. Stop the car. Stop it. Are you crazy? Are you crazy? Let me out of your car, you freak." That's when I abruptly swerved my car in the direction of the back roads where I had initially killed the deer. I gradually accelerated my vehicle through the field of crops and trees, while simultaneously contemplating if I was hallucinating or if my brain was playing sadistic tricks on me. I then casually drew my attention towards the passenger, and I could visibly see the woman's head turn into a deer's. "It's just a deer. It's just a deer. Don't worry. It's just a deer. It's definitely not a hit and run. I just made an honest mistake." In the year 2015, I frequently used the app Uber because I wasn't able to drive for 12 months due to some DUI charges. Just a stupid mistake overall. There's this nightclub bar in my town that I would sometimes go to on the weekends with my friends. Sometimes I would get a ride home with a designated driver if we had one, and sometimes we would catch an Uber. This night, I wasn't feeling too great, so I left a little early. It was somewhere between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. It was way too cold to walk home, so I called for an Uber. A guy nearby named Jack popped up. I got to be honest, he was a little creepy looking. He was older, didn't really smile in his picture, and he had a grayish goatee with a black beanie cap on. He was only 2 miles away, so I didn't really care. It said he had a Chevy Malibu, which sounded nice, so I requested he come pick me up. I waited on the bench outside the club next to the bouncer, who stood still like a statue, hands folded together. About 5 minutes later, a silver 2003 or something Chevy Malibu pulled up in front of the club. I stood up, a bit disappointed it was such an old, ratty-looking car. The guy didn't call me over or honk or anything, he just waited by the curb. So I got up and entered the back seat of the car. Right away, things got uncomfortable. He didn't say hello, he didn't shake my hand, he didn't even turn his head to look at me. All he said, in a very quiet voice, was, "Where are you headed?" To which I replied with my address. We began moving down Main Street, but in the wrong direction of my house. I told him this, and he turned left at the next intersection. Now we were moving away from the main roads and down the quieter residential areas. He didn't put my address into his phone, so I felt really strange. I didn't know if he was expecting me to direct him or not. I ended up putting my address into my own phone so he could listen. When the GPS said, "Turn left down the next street," he completely missed it. I made a confused hand gesture. He noticed it and said, "I just got to make a quick stop. Don't worry, I'll give you a discount." Even though I was drunk, I still knew something bad was going on. That's when I noticed the handgun sticking out from his middle glove box next to him. By now, I was trying to figure out how to get out of this car. At the next red light, I tried the door handle very quietly, but it wouldn't open. I saw that the child lock was on, and from this point forward, my heart was racing. The man was driving farther out of the direction of my house. We must have been 2 towns over by now. I was getting desperate. I couldn't call the cops because I didn't know what this guy might do. I figured my best option would be attempting to flick the child lock switch next to him by the front seats. I had to somehow slide over to the opposite side of the back seat behind him without him noticing. This was one of the most tense moments of my life. I lost my sight on his head through the rearview mirror, making sure he wasn't looking. I very casually slid behind him. Thankfully, he didn't notice. Now came the scariest part. I had to reach for the button up front at the next red light before he could do anything. Each light we passed, I felt more and more tension build up as I was waiting for one of them to turn yellow. Eventually, one finally did. He slowed the car at an intersection that would usually be busy during daylight hours. It was a perfect escape point. The car came to a stop. I knew this light wasn't very long, so I had to be quick. A car was stopped at the opposite side of the intersection, which made me feel a little better. With all my courage, I reached my hand up to the lit-up child lock button. I must have startled him because he jumped 2 inches out from the seat. He screamed at me, and as I feared he would, he went for the gun right next to him. I was able to open the door and flee to the nearby Cadillac Escalade, where I banged on their windows asking for help. They drove off completely avoiding me, but it didn't matter because the man in his Chevy Malibu was already gone down the block. I ran into a nearby grocery store that was open 24 hours, where I called a taxi this time. This was a very sobering experience because I don't remember being drunk at all in that store or during the taxi ride home. I reported the driver to Uber, who said they would escalate the situation to the authorities. It wasn't until a whole week later that an officer finally showed up at my front door for some questioning. That was the end of that. I have no idea what became of that guy, but I've never used an Uber since. I'm looking for a job, and an old friend of mine had clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could due to crowds, so I decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area. I headed in at almost 3 a.m. because it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was really kicking myself for being so cautious though because I was exhausted. I stumbled around the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car had spotted me almost immediately and then pulled up asking, "Boober," while I cluelessly wandered up and down the street searching. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not really familiar with all the surrounding areas and I thought nothing of it. I was pretty alert at first, so I was trying to pass the time playing games on my phone and stuff, but the car didn't have a compatible phone charger and I wasn't sure the building would have one. So, I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down into airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. Now, I don't often even take rideshare, so being alone with a strange driver often put me a bit on edge. But this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother, even young, clean-kept, listening to jazz, nothing that really screamed that you need to micromanage this trip. When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I wasn't in too deep of a sleep and I couldn't fully distinguish it from my finally dream. Awkwardly, he jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, ma'am, we're here." Now, I was a little embarrassed that I'd been that out of it, so I just gave it a hurried thanks and then booked it out of the car and into the building. As I looked around, I began to realize that nothing was what I expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it appeared to be a strip mall plaza. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. Now, I expected some of the lights to be off at nighttime, but not the whole building. I skidded across the concrete foundation comprising what was left of the lobby area, told myself they must just be renovating, and followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages, it was most likely just a few minutes. All I had passed was construction equipment, a couple of long doors, and some smashed windows. I was pretty certain that I wasn't going to find a medical office and figured that maybe I'd mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my text that I had indeed written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair that he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling a second trip, considering this was all his fault. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one that I had taken up. So, it would force me in the middle of the building, meaning there was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs in an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night. I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, especially when it was likely that they were probably on something so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of my friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help get me from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night, and I didn't have enough reception to call for a new ride. But the message wasn't sending. Reception was too weak, so I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell or even windows with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort in the event that whoever was downstairs came upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stair sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated, and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst-case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured, based on my walkabout the floor, it was basically a giant loop. So, I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint in the opposite direction of wherever they were going and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I wasn't anticipating being chased or anything, but I didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might have been living there feel as though I trespassed and then become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in a creepy-ass abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds. The person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured that he had come back for me, realizing that he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So, I then came out from behind the beam that I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed that there was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward, and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly. He was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons why he might have returned. But in the moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes, operating solely on muscle memory and instinct. I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall all the way down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised, but nothing was broken, nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and then threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was way too dark to tell, and I was disoriented from the fall. I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, there's another one of these guys. I stumbled backward, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, a voice called out, "All right, this is the local police department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air now." I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a fight or flight mode and had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I rotated around and yelled, "Hey," I said, "get on the ground right now. Hands out, hands where I can see them." He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did exactly as he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see that he really was a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first, he started asking me all these questions. That, combined with what had just happened and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into me being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He was even asking me easy questions like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke or cut me? Would you rather talk here or outside?" My stunned babbling in response first led him to believe that I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open, facing out, while he stood across from me and asked me the same exact questions yet again. The first thing I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" He explained, "No, nobody called me. I was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of the building that's known to be condemned and nobody's supposed to be inside. When they are, I know they're up to no good." He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or got into some trouble, he had resources he could direct me to and that this wasn't an ideal place to do either of those things. He asked if I had somewhere safe to stay that night. But I was kind of stuck on something else he'd said. Finally, it all clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. The officer looked around, but the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details I remembered, and I told him, but there really weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much, but the officer realized that I could pull up my Uber app and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there, even outdoors, so he sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life. I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. "Hello, I've arrived and I don't see you, I'm flashing my hazards," and finally, "Unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off, thus exonerating himself. But instead, I checked the car details, checked again, and it was definitely not the same driver. The person who had originally driven me there had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said he'd keep an eye out for the guy, but the best that I could give them to go off of was basically, young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, and a goatee, and he drove a 4-door sedan. He was wearing a zip-up sweatshirt and maybe had a hood, which is like one of every 4 guys in this city. I feel so blessed to have survived this near miss. Suffice to say, I don't take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver name. You just really never know. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.